My name is Eric Strebel. Welcome to my channel about product design and making. Let's walk through the basics of doing an old school manual marker rendering. I'm using some Crescent no bleed marker paper, and I'll link to that below if you want to get some to do your own renderings. So I lay everything out with a pencil. The pencil allows me to erase things and change things. I want to get things correct in a nice proportion, so I do them real light in a pencil so that I can make adjustments as needed. This is a standard blow molded product, and we're going to do a straight on side view. So there is no perspective involved here at all. I'll share with you my desk setup. Basically, I'm sitting pretty close to the desk. I've got my markers, my pens, everything that I'm going to need to do this rendering all laid out at my fingertips so that I can grab whatever tool I need to do the rendering appropriately. Now I'm just kind of laying out the basic shapes and blocks of the product, kind of where the highlights and the shadows would fall so that I can map everything out ahead of time. This is important because we're using markers, right? If you mess up, you got to start over, and I don't want to start over. I want to do this rendering one time. So I lay everything out, figure everything out ahead of time about where the light's coming from. We're going to talk about lighting setup in just a second. But once I have this all set up and everything is square and it looks good, then we can move on to setting up a little background. And this is going to help our object pop off the page a little bit, right? I know that my light source is going to be coming from the left, and so the container is going to be a little bit lighter on the left side, and we're using a white piece of paper here. So I want to put a little bit of extra contrast behind the object on the left side to help it pop and read a little bit better when you're looking at the rendering to communicate the information that you want to tell to either your client or your manager or sales, whoever needs to see this. The details are important here. You see me coming in with a kind of fine tip eraser, making sure that I've got everything laid out. So I'm kind of going to be doing this coloring book style in a way, and it's all mapped out ahead of time for me so I know what we're doing. Light source is coming from the left, and I'm going to show this to you. Basically one light source. So if we're looking down on the object, that's me looking at the object here, straight in front of us. The light source is going to be to the left of the object, shining onto it, and it's going to be above that object, and I'll show you what that's going to look like in elevation view. And this is important so that you know what it is you're rendering and you have a plan. You can set up still lives to train your eye and teach you how to do your lighting setups. It's very valuable. I'm going to use a set of custom markers. They're red. I did this in a previous video about how to make your own set of custom gradient markers. I'm going to start off here with a 20% red. All right. I'm pretty much going to be blocking in the entire unit with this red, and that's going to become my base. And from there, we're going to make things darker, and in the end, we're going to come back and lighten up some of the highlight areas with some Prismacolors. But first, I'm just kind of blocking everything in, kind of training my brain about how things are going to look and come together. It also helps me just to fill in all the little spaces and the squares. I use some darker markers here just to get a little bit of variation, because you will have some of that across the front of the unit, right? It has a small bend or curve in that front surface, and the light source is coming from the left. It'll be a little bit more intense from the left and then fade as it goes to the right. Things will naturally get darker as they go away from the light, and you want to enhance this effect and use that to your advantage to tell your story here. So at this point, I'm just coming back in, blocking everything in with this 20% red. I really like it. The only part that I'm leaving is down here at the bottom, and you can see that is actually going to stay a very light color because light's going to be hitting that the most intense. I end up filling some of it in a little bit later on. So let's go to a darker, this is a 50% red, and I'm starting to block in some of the surfaces that are facing away from the light, and you'll see the objects start to take on some form. Form change equals value change, right? So as we change the values of this object, it starts to trick our eye into seeing the form that the object actually is. So this is a rendering and it's an illusion, right? It's a drawing. We are trying to convey some information about form, and we are using value change from the marker to trick our eyes into believing that this is a three-dimensional object so that we can understand it. But knowing where the light comes from is very important in setting up this basic rendering. And that surface, as it changes on the right-hand side of the bottle or this container, flips away from the light and gets quite a bit darker. Now, it's never a uniform sort of lighting thing, right? Light goes from light to dark, and as it fades, as it goes away from the light, things get a little bit darker, and there's always variations in the plastic, and you want to try to show that in the product to convey some realism, to show that you understand about manufacturing, how a bottle like this actually looks when it's made, blow molded in the end. Some of the basic values are kind of blocked in here at this point, but we want to build up those values, make the darks a little bit darker, make the gradations really nice as it goes from light to dark. And you see me continually working around, coming back, adding different values of the marker to show the different surfaces. And you're always building up the values slowly, right? Light to dark. You never work the other way around with markers, or very rarely. If you go too light, that's okay. You can always add more value to make things a little bit darker. And having these red graded markers is obviously a bonus. That's something that's a little bit tougher to do if you have to go to the store and buy a set of reds that all kind of work together. You never get 10 of them that work in unison. So this is a real kind of luxury, kind of the reason I'm doing this rendering, to sort of show the value of having a set of graded markers, right? You could do the same rendering in gray, then you have a gray object, of course, but there is no such thing as a red or a green or a blue set of graded markers unless you make them yourself. You can check out that video that I made of the markers as well. I'll put a link here in the description below, as well as up here on the right, so you can go and check out that video. So here we are, just building up the value a little bit more every single time. So I'm constantly going back and forth between the markers, slowly adding a little bit more. You'll notice, particularly with this paper, it kind of soaks up the markers, and they kind of, as they dry, they get a little bit lighter. And so you have to come back sometimes and kind of darken things up. We're going to have a dark cap, maybe, 50% gray cap, something like that. So I fill that in, and now it's time to add some value to the background. And I'm using a 30% gray here. The problem is it's not a very juicy 30% gray, and I'm having to come back several times to fill in all the area that needs the gray. So this is taking a little bit of extra time to come back and do this value. It's good. I usually have 2 or 3 extra ones, but I don't. So I just gotta wait and come back and do this continuously. We're using a 50% gray here on the cap to get a little bit of a jump off the page, a little bit of contrast against that background, a little darker. We can still distinguish it from the bottle. And we're going to keep building up that background value to get it to that 30% value everywhere. And also, I want to make it uniform if I can. I'm going to end up doing a little slight gradation on there to make the container pop a little bit. You'll see me continue to work on that a little bit. Now we're going to go and use some of these gel pens to start outlining the container, and this is going to give it some definition and it's going to help it pop off the page. I'm using a 0.3 gel pen here, not the finest that I have and not the heaviest, and just going around the outside, giving it definition, giving it that darker line, especially on the outside. Those lines are going to be the darkest. On the inside, we might use, or I will use, a finer tip gel pen. And I'm using a gel pen because it doesn't bleed, so if I add more marker later, it won't bleed everywhere like it would on a ballpoint pen. I've recently kind of switched from ballpoint pens to gel pens for doing renderings because they don't bleed. And I will link in the description to these Hi-Tech Cs that I'm using here. They're very nice. The nice thing too about these Hi-Tech Cs is the relatively precision, so I can put a little bevel on the cap and I can put some detailed ridges in there. I just freehand those. They don't have to be super straight, super perfect. They just need to convey the story and the illusion of the texture or the ridges on the cap. You see me rolling some of the darker lines here. I'm probably using a 0.4 or a 0.5 gel pen on things that I want to be a little darker, particularly on the bottom. As the surface rolls underneath, it would naturally get a little bit darker, and I'm going to use a little bit heavier line weight on those to help convey that story of maybe a little bit of shadow. We're going to darken up the ground that it's sitting on, and I'm using a Sharpie here just to get a really thicker, heavier ground line. Really helps me anchor the item on the ground so it's not floating, and tells the user that it's sitting on a desk and it would lay flat. I also come here in the background and I outline this just to give it a little bit of definition with a 50% gray. You don't have to do that, but I like to do that, just kind of frame in that background almost like a little painting. Give it a little bit of definition, not too much. I don't want it to be too distracting, right? We just want to help give the form a little bit more contrast. And here I come back in with 30% gray after it's had a time to set. You know, it's a dark, it's a marker that's not very juicy. It's kind of dried up. So I'm just having a little bit of a fade from the outside in. Again, increase that contrast as it gets towards the container. That stays the most contrast. Here we're going to add prismacolor white, and this is how we're going to lighten up these surfaces. I'm doing this with a white prismacolor pencil. I'll link to that in the description below if you want to get some. This is pretty standard fare. Now, also the nice thing about this paper and this Prismacolor pencil is it picks up a little bit of a texture from the tooth of the paper, and it's actually very much like the texture you get on a blow molded bottle, almost like the hair cell, or sometimes when those blow molded bottles, they get almost like a texture, like a little tiny crater effect from the heat from when they're molded, because they're molded under such high heat. But this pencil really gives me a lot of control and allows me to really show a nice gradual fade from the left side to the right? So the left is closer to the light source, and that light drops off as it goes to the right. And this pencil is what allows me to do that. and it allows me to come through everywhere on the edges where it would catch a little bit of light from the light source and really kind of give the rendering some punch and some pop. And this white color pencil is the way to do that. It's very traditional. Here I come back, just cleaning up some of the lines, highlight lines at the very bottom. Coming back, and I feel like I need a little bit of definition on this highlight there at the bottom, and I pop in a little bit of black. It's a 0.25 gel. I want some more light. I want it to be a little more dramatic from the left to the right, and I come in, and again, slowly building up the value of all the tools that I'm using, whether it's the color pencil or the marker, slowly building up the value to get it to the right value and to show the effect that I want. I can always come in and grind in that color pencil or the marker or whatever it is I need, but you're building up those values gradually. Here I'm using a jelly roll just to give me some highlights on the cap only, right? The bottle, really not that shiny. The cap's maybe a little bit shinier, and you're gonna get that high contrast from the plastic where you don't get that on the bottle itself because it's pretty matte. Sign my name, and that's it for the manual part. We'll pull it into a digital application and we'll do a little levels adjustment right here just to kind of get the background to be a nice white. There actually is a little bit of texture from the tooth of the paper that is left over. I'm not going for a total bright white. I don't want to remove the texture that was from the markers and the paper. I want to leave that there. That's part of the appeal of the rendering. Good luck. Have fun doing your renderings. Make sure you give the video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already done so. Don't forget to follow me on social media. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Rock on. Click here to check out some of the other design and making videos that I have that you might enjoy.